The morning I realized someone was stealing my land, I spent nearly 15 minutes convincing myself I was wrong. That's the part nobody talks about. People imagine that when something serious happens, you immediately recognize it. Like a movie where dramatic music starts playing and everybody knows exactly what's going on. Real life doesn't work that way. Sometimes your brain fights reality because reality is too stupid to make sense. I was standing in the middle of my lower pasture just after sunrise, holding a coffee thermos that had already gone cold, staring at a fence that wasn't supposed to exist. And the strangest part wasn't the fence. It was the fact that I knew every inch of that field so well that my body could feel something was wrong before my mind caught up. My name is Wyatt Harper. I live outside a little town in western Kentucky, and my family has worked the same 83 acres since before I was born, before my father. Before my grandfather. The place isn't fancy. Never was. Rolling grass, a creek cutting across the northern edge, old oak trees scattered around like they were planted by accident, and fences that always needed one more repair than you had time for. But it was ours. And if you've ever lived your whole life on a piece of land, you understand something most people don't. Land becomes part of your memory. You don't just remember it, you carry it. My grandfather used to tell me, "Son, a man can forget where he left his truck keys, but he'll never forget where his property line is." At the time, I thought that was just old farmer wisdom. Years later, I learned he was right. My dad passed away 3 years before all this happened. Cancer. Fast at the end, the kind that makes you think you have more time until suddenly you don't. The last real conversation we had wasn't emotional. No dramatic speeches, no movie scene. He sat on the porch looking across the pasture and said, "Keep the place together." That was it. Just 5 words. But I knew exactly what he meant, because land rarely disappears all at once. Usually it gets chipped away. A little here, a little there, one compromise at a time. For a while, everything stayed quiet. The neighbors were good people. Everybody respected boundaries. Then the old Jenkins property next door sold, and that's where the story really starts. The buyer was a development company called Silver Ridge Communities, the kind of company that sells people a version of country life without any actual country life attached to it. Luxury homes, private roads, artificial lakes, carefully curated nature. The brochure made it look like heaven. The reality looked like bulldozers. Within weeks, survey trucks started showing up, then engineers, then contractors. Then enough machinery to make the ground vibrate during dinner. At first, I didn't pay much attention. People sell land. Developers build things. That's life. Then I met Gavin Mercer. Now, Gavin was the kind of man who always looked like he had just stepped out of a magazine advertisement. Perfect haircut, perfect smile, perfect boots that somehow never got dirty. I met him when he drove up my gravel driveway in a black SUV worth more than my truck and probably my barn combined. He stepped out smiling. "Mr. Harper," he said, "beautiful property." I remember looking down at my mud-covered jeans and then back at his spotless jacket. Appreciated. He looked across my fields. Not at me. Across me. Like I was standing between him and something he wanted. "We're excited about the new community." That's nice. His smile never changed. "We'd love to maintain a positive relationship with neighboring landowners." That sounded harmless enough. But then he started asking questions. Boundary lines, access roads, survey records, utility easements. The conversation felt less like a neighbor introducing himself and more like someone studying a blueprint. So I walked him over to the eastern fence line, showed him the original survey markers, old iron pins set decades ago, still exactly where they'd always been. I told him everything was documented, recorded, verified. Simple. He nodded and took pictures, lots of pictures. Then he said something that stayed with me. "Clarity prevents problems." At the time, it sounded reasonable. Looking back, it sounded more like preparation. 6 months passed. Construction exploded. Trees disappeared. Roads appeared. The quiet countryside started sounding like an airport construction zone. Then little things began happening. Survey crews standing suspiciously close to my fence. Workers wandering near property markers. Equipment parked where it shouldn't be. Nothing major. Nothing worth starting a fight over. Just enough to make me uncomfortable. One afternoon, my friend Curtis stopped by. Curtis had been delivering gravel to the development site. He sat on my porch drinking sweet tea and said, "You know those developers ask a lot about your place." I looked at him. "What kind of questions?" He shrugged. "Mostly boundaries, ownership records, how long you've been here, I laughed. That's weird. Curtis didn't laugh. Yeah. That was the moment the knot first appeared in my stomach. Not fear, not yet, just instinct. The kind farmers learn to trust. Animals have it. Old ranchers have it. Something feels wrong long before you can explain why. A few weeks later, I found out exactly why. That morning started like every other morning. Coffee, feed buckets, checking fences, the sun barely coming up over the hills. Then I reached the lower eastern pasture and stopped. My fence was gone, completely gone. Not damaged, not knocked down, gone. In its place stood a bright white vinyl fence stretching across the property like it had always belonged there. Perfectly straight, perfectly clean, perfectly wrong. I remember standing there blinking, actually blinking, like my eyes needed recalibrating. I walked toward it, slowly, every step making my stomach tighter. Then I saw the survey stakes. Fresh metal markers, newly installed, and every one of them sat several feet inside my property. I knew it instantly, not because of measurements, because of memory, because I'd walked that line thousands of times, because my grandfather had walked it. My father had walked it, and now someone else was trying to rewrite it. I pulled out my phone, called Gavin Mercer. He answered on the second ring. Cheerful, relaxed, like he had been expecting the call. Morning, Wyatt. I looked at the fence, then at the field beyond it, then back at the fence, and for the first time I heard my own voice shaking. What did you do to my property? There was a pause, a very small pause, the kind people make when they already know the answer, and then Gavin laughed, not loudly, just enough, like I'd misunderstood something obvious. And right then, standing there in the grass with the sunrise behind me, and that fence cutting across land my family had owned for generations, I realized this wasn't an accident. It was the beginning of a war. Gavin's laugh stuck with me long after the call ended, not because it was loud, not because it was insulting, because it sounded confident. That's what bothered me. Confident people don't laugh like that unless they think they've already won. I stood there staring at that white fence while he explained, in the calm voice of a man discussing weather forecasts, that Silver Ridge had completed an updated GPS survey and discovered the historical boundary line had been inaccurate. Inaccurate, I said. These things happen. No, they don't. Another pause. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. If it helps, we'd be willing to work out a lease agreement so you can continue using the strip. A lease agreement. For my own land. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because sometimes your brain doesn't know what else to do. I hung up before I said something that would have ended up in a sheriff's report. Then I walked the fence again, this time slower, looking at every marker, every post, every inch. The farther I walked, the worse it got, because it wasn't just a few feet, it was a few feet stretched across nearly a quarter mile. That adds up, not just in acreage, in principle. The thing about theft is that people always focus on quantity. How much was taken? How valuable was it? But that's not the real question. The real question is, who decided they had the right? That afternoon, I called a man named Raymond Cole, no relation to Gavin. Just one of those funny small-town coincidences. Raymond had retired years earlier, but before that he'd been one of the most respected surveyors in western Kentucky. He'd worked alongside my father, attended my parents' wedding, been around longer than most of the buildings in town. When I explained the situation, he didn't hesitate. I'll be there tomorrow morning. The next day we started walking before sunrise. Raymond carried an old leather notebook that looked older than I was. He moved slowly, talked very little, measured everything. Twice. Sometimes 3 times. Hours passed. The sun climbed. The heat got worse. Still he kept checking. Finally he stood up, brushed dirt off his knees and looked directly at me. Your line didn't move. I nodded. Because I already knew, but hearing somebody else say it mattered. Then his expression changed. Not confused, not surprised, angry. Come with me. He led me toward the construction area, past equipment trailers, past stacks of lumber, past a temporary storage lot. Then he stopped. At first I didn't understand what I was looking at. It was just a pile of scrap metal mixed with dirt and debris. Then Raymond bent down, reached into the pile, and pulled out an IM survey pin. My survey pin, one of the originals, the same type installed decades earlier, the same type recorded in county documentation, the same type that should have been buried at the property corner. Instead, it was lying in a trash pile. I felt something shift inside me, because mistakes don't end up in scrap heaps. Intent does. Raymond turned the pin over in his hand. Somebody pulled these. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because suddenly every strange conversation, every survey crew, every question, every little warning sign started lining up into one picture. And the picture wasn't pretty. That night I'd barely slept. I sat at the kitchen table going through old records, survey maps, property deeds, tax documents, photographs, my father's paperwork, my grandfather's notes, page after page confirming the same thing. The boundary had never changed. The next morning I called Gavin again, not because I expected honesty, because I wanted to hear what he would say after I knew the truth. He answered immediately. "Wyatt, you pulled my survey markers." Silence, longer this time. Then came the lawyer voice, measured, careful, controlled. "Our legal team has reviewed all documentation." I laughed. "Funny. My surveyor reviewed it too. Then perhaps this matter should proceed through proper channels." Translation: "See you in court." The call ended, and so did any chance of handling things privately. 2 days later, I filed formal complaints. Boundary encroachment, property interference, unauthorized removal of survey markers. The clerk processing the paperwork looked up at me halfway through. "You got evidence?" "Plenty." She nodded. "Good," like she'd seen this movie before. Only now it was my turn to play the lead role. A week later, Sheriff Doug Bennett came out to the farm. Doug wasn't flashy, no cowboy hat, no dramatic speeches, just a practical man with 30 years of experience dealing with people making bad decisions. We walked the eastern boundary together. He listened more than he talked. When we reached one of the disturbed marker locations, he crouched down and ran his fingers through the soil. Then he stood up and looked toward the development site. "You know what gets people in trouble?" he asked. I shrugged. "Greed." He smiled. "Greed's normal. Confidence gets people in trouble." I thought about Gavin, and suddenly that laugh from our phone call made perfect sense. Doug arranged for an independent survey. Someone from outside the county. Someone neither side could influence. A week later, Dr. Evelyn Hart arrived. She was younger than I expected, sharp-eyed, efficient, the kind of person who looked like she noticed details before other people noticed they existed. For 3 days, she measured everything. She reviewed historical plats, county records, GPS coordinates, aerial maps, old survey notes, new survey notes, new survey notes, every possible source. On the third afternoon, she finally approached me. I could tell by her face she had reached a conclusion. "What do you find?" I asked. She looked back toward the white fence, then at the survey stakes, then at me. "These offsets are intentional." Just 6 words. But they hit harder than anything else so far. Intentional. Not mistaken, not accidental, not disputed. Intentional. By then, things started moving quickly. The sheriff's office collected evidence, photographed the original pins, documented locations, interviewed contractors, reviewed permits, and that's when Silver Ridge changed tactics. Instead of claiming confusion, they went on offense. A certified letter arrived at my house. Thick envelope, expensive stationery, expensive lawyers. The letter accused me of interfering with construction operations, trespassing, defamation, harassment. I sat at my kitchen table reading it, then read it again, then laughed so hard coffee nearly came out my nose. Because there is something genuinely hilarious about being accused of trespassing on land your grandfather bought before the people accusing you were born. Still, the message was clear. They wanted me intimidated. They wanted me tired. They wanted me expensive. The problem was they had picked the wrong guy. Farmers understand long fights. Everything we do is a long fight. Weather, markets, equipment, drought, floods. Nothing comes easy, and patience becomes a survival skill. So instead of arguing publicly, I got quieter. I hired an attorney named Rebecca Sloan. Rebecca had a reputation that made grown businessmen nervous. Not because she yelled, because she listened. The first time we met, she spent 3 hours reviewing documents without saying much. Finally, she leaned back. "What have I told you? This isn't about 6 feet." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" She tapped the development map. "If they move your line, every lot behind it becomes larger." I stared at the drawing. Then I started seeing it. Not one theft. Multiple. The adjustment affected road placements, property values, drainage plans, future lot dimensions, everything. Rebecca nodded. Someone didn't steal a strip of land. She paused. They redesigned a business model. That realization changed everything. Because suddenly this wasn't about a stubborn farmer protecting a fence line. This was about a development worth millions of dollars. And if we were right, somebody had risked all of it over a few feet of ground. What none of us knew yet was that the most damaging evidence in the entire case wasn't buried in the dirt. It wasn't hidden in county records. And it wasn't sitting inside a survey report. It was sitting on a company computer, waiting for someone to find it. By the time we reached the discovery phase of the lawsuit, I had already spent months living in a strange state somewhere between anger and exhaustion. If you've never been in a legal fight, let me tell you something. The movies lie. Most of it isn't dramatic. Most of it is paperwork, phone calls, waiting, more waiting, then waiting for the waiting to finish. Meanwhile, life keeps moving. The cattle still need feeding. The grass still needs cutting. Bills still show up. And every morning that white fence was still sitting there like an insult nailed into the landscape. What kept me going was simple. I knew I wasn't crazy. I knew what that property line was. And eventually, facts have a way of catching up with people. The break came on a Thursday afternoon. I remember because I was repairing a gate when Rebecca called. Her voice sounded different, not excited. Focused, the way a hunter sounds when they've finally found tracks. You need to come into town. What happened? We found something. I drove there immediately. When I walked into her office, she slid a printed document across the desk. Just one page. At first, it didn't look important. An internal company email, a routine message, the kind nobody thinks twice about. Then I started reading. My stomach dropped. The email came from Gavin Mercer. The subject line was harmless. The body wasn't. Shift the eastern boundary slightly. Historical markers create complications. Adjacent owner unlikely to challenge. Proceed before final plat approval. I read it twice, then a third time. Not because I didn't understand it, because I did. And once I understood it, everything changed. Rebecca folded her arms. That's not a mistake. No, that's instruction. I nodded, because there wasn't another word for it. Instruction. Intent. Proof. For months, Silver Ridge had been hiding behind confusion, survey disagreements, mapping discrepancies, technical interpretations. One email destroyed all of it. The sheriff's office got a copy the same day. Then things started moving fast. Faster than Gavin expected. Faster than Silver Ridge expected. Faster than anyone expected. A week later, investigators interviewed one of the site's supervisors, then another. Then a subcontractor who had worked directly with the survey crews. Apparently, pressure does interesting things to people, especially when prison becomes a possibility. The subcontractor's name was Eric Dalton. I had met him once. Quiet guy, never looked me in the eye. At the time, I assumed he was shy. Turns out he was carrying a guilty conscience. Eric eventually signed an affidavit, and when he did, the entire case cracked open. According to his statement, Gavin personally instructed survey crews to remove the original markers. Not suggest, not imply, not recommend. Instruct. Eric claimed Gavin believed the adjustment would never be questioned because most property owners didn't know their boundaries well enough to notice. That part stayed with me, because it revealed the real problem. Arrogance, not greed, not money. Arrogance. The belief that ordinary people aren't paying attention. The belief that if you're powerful enough, reality becomes flexible. The belief that ownership belongs to whoever can get away with claiming it. News spread quickly after that. Small towns have their own internet. It's called people talking. Feed stores, gas stations, church parking lots, local diners. By the end of the week, everybody knew. By the end of the month, everybody had an opinion. Some defended Gavin, most didn't, but almost everyone agreed on one thing. If somebody can move one property line, what stops them from moving another? The story stopped being about me. It became about trust. And trust is worth more than real estate. Silver Ridge tried to contain the damage. Public statements started appearing. Words like misunderstanding, clarification, adjustment, reconciliation, corporate language designed to sound meaningful while saying absolutely nothing. The problem was that facts had already escaped, and facts don't fit back inside press releases. A few local reporters started digging, then regional media picked it up, then investors started asking questions, then buyers started asking questions, then lenders started asking questions, and suddenly a project that had looked unstoppable began wobbling. I saw Gavin one last time before court. It happened outside the county courthouse. He was standing near the entrance talking to two attorneys. For a moment our eyes met. Neither of us said anything. Then he walked over. Not aggressively, not confidently, just tired, older somehow. Like the previous year had aged him 10. He stopped a few feet away. You could have worked this out. I stared at him. That sentence genuinely amazed me. After everything, after the emails, after the lies, after the stolen markers, that was still his version of reality. I shook my head. No. His jaw tightened. People make mistakes. I looked directly at him. And why'd you hide the pins? For the first time since I'd known him, Gavin didn't have an answer. Not a clever one, not a polished one. Nothing. He just turned and walked away. And honestly, that silence said more than any confession ever could. The courtroom itself wasn't dramatic. No surprise witnesses, no screaming attorneys, no movie speeches, just evidence, documents, records, measurements, emails, testimony. One fact after another stacked so neatly together that eventually there wasn't room left for excuses. The independent survey confirmed the encroachment. The original markers matched historical records. The subcontractor's affidavit matched physical evidence. The email established intent. Everything fit, like pieces of a puzzle finally showing the whole picture. Before the trial could fully conclude, Gavin accepted a plea agreement: property fraud, survey manipulation, interference with recorded boundary markers. The exact charges mattered less than what they represented. Accountability. The subcontractor lost his professional certifications permanently. Financial penalties followed. Restitution followed. Civil settlements followed. In the end, Silver Ridge agreed to pay damages, legal expenses, restoration costs, and compensation related to lost use of the property. The final amount was substantial. More money than I'd ever imagined receiving. But here's the truth. Nobody likes hearing. The money wasn't the satisfying part. The satisfying part came months later. One evening I drove out toward the old development site. Construction had mostly stopped. Several investors had pulled out. Sales had collapsed. Future expansion plans were frozen indefinitely. Half-finished foundations sat exposed beneath the setting sun. Stacks of unused materials gathered dust. Survey flags fluttered in the wind. For months that place had looked unstoppable. Now it looked abandoned. Not because someone destroyed it, because the truth finally caught up. I parked my truck and sat there for a while, just watching, thinking, realizing how close it had all come. If I hadn't noticed, if Raymond hadn't checked, if Rebecca hadn't pushed, if investigators hadn't found that email, the theft would have become permanent. A few feet would have quietly become history, and eventually nobody would have remembered it happened. That thought bothered me more than the theft itself, because the most dangerous lies aren't the loud ones. They're the quiet ones people get used to. A few months after everything ended, Raymond and I walked the property line one last time. The original iron markers had been restored. Properly documented, properly measured, properly placed. The white vinyl fence was gone. In its place stood a repaired barbed wire fence that leaned slightly in places and looked far less impressive. But it was honest, and sometimes honest beats impressive. We stopped near one of the corner markers. The sun was setting, the same way it had thousands of times before. Raymond looked down at the iron pin, then out across the pasture. You know what this was really about? I smiled. I've heard a lot of answers. He nodded. Most people think land disputes are about land. I waited. They're about whether truth has to ask permission from power. For a while, neither of us said anything, because there wasn't much left to say. The boundary was back where it belonged. The records matched reality again. The fight was over. Or at least as over as these things ever get. Gavin left the county less than a year later. Silver Ridge eventually rebranded under new management, new logos, new marketing, new promises. Companies are good at changing names, but land doesn't change names. It remembers. Sometimes I still wonder about that. I wonder if people living there today know what happened. I wonder if they walk those streets without realizing part of that neighborhood nearly started with a lie. Or maybe they know and simply don't care. Maybe success wipes the slate clean for some people. Maybe consequences never feel big enough. Maybe justice depends entirely on who's telling the story. And that's where I want to leave this with you. Because I still don't know the answer. If Gavin had never been caught, if nobody had found the email, if the property line had quietly stayed where he moved it, would that land eventually have become his simply because enough time passed? Or does ownership belong to the truth, no matter how long it takes for the truth to fight its way back? Let me know what you think in the comments. Was Gavin a criminal who got exactly what he deserved, or was he just another businessman pushing limits in a world where people only care when they get caught? I genuinely like to hear your perspective. And if you enjoy real stories about justice, property rights, small-town conflicts, and the moments when ordinary people stand their ground against powerful interests, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who'd have an opinion on where the line between ambition and theft really is. Because sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought over money, they're fought over whether the truth still matters.